righty. Good evening. We're so glad you're here. Trish isn't here and Betty, so I don't. They might not be finding this parking space. I know that's a shame. We have to get a valet service started, so put that on my to-do list.
Yeah, put it on the wish list, Barbara.
Yes, but we're so glad you're here, and we may get some more drifting in. But we're going to go ahead and get started. And my name is Barbara Udit, and I'm the president of the Gulf Breeze Area Historical Society, and we're so excited to have you here tonight. Nicole Grinnan has been here before, and so we're so excited to have her back. But I'm going to first get us started by opening us with prayer. If you'll bow with me. Dear Heavenly Father, we just praise you for this beautiful day and beautiful weather. And even though we wish we had more parking, I'll help anybody who's trying to park and come in, find a space. But thank you for all the blessings in our life. Thank you for this beautiful place that we live in. And thank you for just everything, Father. Keep us centered and grounded and focused on you and not on things that would distract us and take us away from what you would want us to be doing. And be with us tonight, and just bless everyone who's here and their families and their health, and in those who could not be here because of issues of health. We just give them a special blessing. We love you and we pray in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, I'm going to ask Jim Cox to come up and introduce our special speaker tonight. Oh, there's Trish and Betty. We were just praying for parking spaces.
I think that's my turn.
The pledge.
The pledge.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Barbara,
Thank you.
I'm pretty excited to have the honor of leading in the Pledge of
Everybody
Allegiance.
would stand.
Everybody
This
stand
is
back.
Bernie, and
Thank
he's going to start us off with the Pledge
Here we
of
go.
Allegiance.
Pledge of Allegiance.
To the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
I always forget something. Okay, Jim, I'll let you come up and introduce yourself.
S-I-S-E.
I'm Jim Cox, okay, and I'm Barbara's slave. But I am delighted to reintroduce, okay, Nicole Grinnan. Okay, she was here about a year ago, okay, talking about shipwrecks in Pensacola Bay. Okay, and due to time constraints we placed on her, okay, she wasn't able to talk about some of the other shipwrecks that she really loves, especially the Russian shipwreck. A Russian shipwreck here in Pensacola Bay, that's kind of hard to imagine, isn't it? Okay, so here she is tonight. Come and see, okay?
Well, thank you all for having me back. It was such a pleasure speaking with you about a year ago about the shipwrecks of Northwest Florida. And I think in the many amazing questions that I got towards the end of that presentation, one of them came up about what my favorite shipwreck was here in the Pensacola, or in our area more broadly. And when people ask me that question, I always talk about the San Pablo. This is my favorite shipwreck for more than one reason. Not only does it have an absolutely incredible history, but it's also a fantastic dive center. So in kind of the other half of my life, I'm a scuba diver locally. I do dive instruction at one of our scuba shops in town. I'm doing that less these days as my little girl starts to grow up. I have less time. Imagine that. But diving is one of my favorite things to do, and especially on shipwreck sites. And we're so lucky here in Northwest Florida that not only do we have some really incredible water and marine life, but we also have really fantastic places to go and see those things. And so that, I think, was the genesis of me coming back and talking about the shipwreck. So I'm so glad to be back. Thank you for having me. Like Jim said, my name is Nicole Grinnan. I think I've seen or know many of you from previous talks. I used to be with the Florida Public Archaeology Network. More recently, I received a promotion, and I'm now on campus at the University of West Florida as the Assistant Director for our Archaeology Institute.
Yay.
Yeah. You're asking, what is the Archaeology Institute? Mostly what we do are special projects. We run the field schools for all of the students who get their training during the summertime. And we also do contract archaeology ahead of development projects, both on land and underwater. So we kind of, we're jacks of all trades up at the Institute. And I think I fit in pretty well there because I feel like I do all the things all the time time, if you are a boater, if you're a diver, you've probably heard tell of the Russian freighter. And Jim, I'm so sorry, I'm gonna like burst the bubble here. I don't wanna disappoint you all, but the Russian freighter is not actually Russian. And we don't know how it got that name. It's just kind of one of those local lore things that came up. But historical research reveals, you know, it would be cool to have a Russian ship in our waters, but I think the story is actually much more exciting. The ship's actual name, although we often refer to it as the Russian freighter, the ship's actual name is San Pablo.
Ah, okay.
So, yes, San Pablo, despite the name, actually began her life in Ireland in 1915. She was renamed eventually, but San Pablo started her life in Ireland, in Belfast, in 1915. She's 315 feet long, 44 feet in beam or width, and she was primarily a fruit transport ship in most of her life. She was essentially carrying fruit back and forth from Central America to the United States for the company that she worked for. So she was what we would refer to as a banana boat for most of her life. During World War II, she was sunk by a German U-boat off of the coast of Costa Rica, where she was taking on a load of fruit. But she was refloated and eventually towed to Pensacola to take place in what became a secret military operation. And thus begins the story of her wrecking here off of the coast of Pensacola. So the presentation tonight will hopefully give you a little bit of detail about the military operation that created San Pablo and the dive spot that we know and love today. One of the cool things and one of my favorite things about this presentation is that we actually have videos. And one of those videos dates to the 1944 sinking of this shipwreck offshore, filmed by the United States Navy. So it's kind of a treat, I think, tonight. And having the TV will help because there are speakers built in. So we'll get started here. So the secret operation that involved San Pablo once she arrived here in Pensacola was named Project Campbell. And this was an operation of the Office of Strategic Services. So if you're a history buff, you probably know that the Office of Strategic Services, or the OSS, was the kind of the early iteration of what eventually became known as the Central Intelligence Agency, or the CIA. And again, we're talking about a World War II time frame here. The reason why we know so much about this shipwreck site is because most of these secret reports were declassified after the war. The project report for Project Campbell was published in 1944, but it was eventually made public in 1965, so about 10 years later, or 20 years later, I'm sorry. But the idea behind Project Campbell was essentially to come up with a scheme to end the war in the Pacific, right? It was a huge drain on resources, not to mention the incredible loss of life on both sides of the battlefield. And so the American military was coming up with a variety of different schemes to try and make that war end more quickly. Why didn't they eventually end up using Operation Campbell? Well, the answer to that is simple. They had another operation that had greater prospect for ending the war. And again, if you're familiar with World War II history, you know that what actually ended the war was the Manhattan Project, right? And the dropping of bombs on Japan, or nuclear weapons on Japan. So Operation Campbell was shelved, but it's still a really cool story. So a lot of the pictures that I've got in the presentation early on are from the report that was declassified in 1965. So here is kind of the introduction to it. I've highlighted a section that I think is most interesting and kind of gives you the overview of what they were trying to do. The mission of Campbell is the sabotage of enemy targets, inaccessible to other methods of attack. So what they were trying to do with this project, and I'll tell you how in a minute, what they were trying to do was to get into Japan's harbors, right, without detection, and be able to blow up their battleships and other military vessels without actually sending people in there to do that kind of thing, and not being detected at the same time. So my favorite line here is that they did this through operational ruse and deception. So a lot of the story is kind of, if you're into kind of like spycraft and, James Bond and those kinds of things, it's an interesting look at the way these things were put together in the 1940s during World War II. So what did Operation Campbell entail? Well, essentially, the first kind of component of the operation was to create a missile. And the missiles in this case were envisioned to be a variety of small watercraft. Things like the A-2 Hackercraft, the A-3 Hackercraft on the top, and then a much larger Army rescue boat. And what they were going to do was they were going to disguise these small craft, load them with explosives, and then manually control them via remote control into harbors in Japan, right? And the idea would be that they could send these things in without an operator via remote control and some kind of James Bond-like, scenario, and hit an enemy vessel and sink it in place without any loss of life on the American part. So it's a really good plan, and it sounds kind of, like, oh, remote control. We have remote control on absolutely everything these days. But in 1944, this was an incredible technology, right? Things you would only have dreamed of 20 years prior in World War I. So the idea was to remote control these vessels in, and you could have your controller in a variety of different places. Probably you don't want them on the ground in Japan because you'd have to get them there in the first place, but if you had a plane nearby or a larger mothership offshore in Japan, a submarine, and then I put shore on here because that was included in the report. They decided not to do that. But any of these kind of remote places are where your operators could be. The other part, aside from the missile, the other part of the project was having the remote control. And so there's all these great photos in this report of early remote, RC controlled devices. So they would have the receivers and the transmitters, which is what you're seeing in the photos there. They ended up testing Operation Campbell using a plane. So they didn't use a larger ship and they didn't use a submarine, they used a plane to test and make sure this would actually work. On here, I know it's probably difficult to see in this tiny text, but it gives you an idea of what they were loading onto these vessels in terms of the mass of explosives. So for the smallest vessel that they could use as a missile was the A-2 Hackercraft. This was about 34 feet long, right? And this is a vessel with an engine in it or a motor on it. And on that craft, they predicted that they could load up to 5,000 pounds of explosives. On the little bit larger A-3 Hackercraft, they could load up to 10,000 pounds of explosives. And then on the much larger Army rescue boat, which was 85 feet in length, so this is a sizable boat, they could load up to 50,000 pounds of explosives. So they could do some real damage to ships. And what they wanted to do in their operational test for this project was see what was the ideal disguise, the ideal size of your remote control missile craft, and how much explosives do you really need to sink an enemy vessel. So I mentioned that they ended up using the plane for their test. So whatever size of the missile craft and the amount of explosives, the remote control equipment aboard the remote control point, so in this case the plane, would have been the same. On the vessel itself, it would have had an antenna to pick up the radio signals that would have steered the vessel. The receiver would have activated a number of units, which would have directed things like the ignition, the throttle, the rudder on the vessel, and the various other controls on the boat. Again, like for us today, thinking about remote control, it's like, yeah, of course they could do that. But back then, this was huge, right? So they spent a lot of time on this and a lot of space in this report explaining how remote control works. So what you're seeing here is essentially a cutaway. You have the plane, but then a cutaway of the craft. And so you can see where they have the antenna and the receiver. You can also see they had mechanisms in that bottom picture to control the tiller on the boat and those kinds of things, the rudder and the throttle. And then the fun part, the demolition. So this is kind of the other component of this. What were they doing? So these craft, when they were loaded up with explosives, had two different kinds of explosives to make this plan work. One of the first things they had on it was essentially a pinup device that was intended to scuttle this craft, right? So the first step was to get this craft below the surface of the water. I'll have a picture of that in a second. So that was the first explosion, right? And it would have been small, because all they had to do was sink this tiny boat. The second explosive that was on board was the scuttling charge. And this is what was intended to destroy the enemy craft. And so what they did with this, so essentially what would happen is you would drive this boat up to your enemy vessel. On the bow of the vessel, right here where letter D is, you would have a pinup device. And this would send essentially two steel holding pins into the side of your enemy vessel, right? So puncturing the outer hull of that vessel, locking in place this smaller craft. The pinup device would also trigger the scuttling charge, which would send the rest of the boat underwater, still connected to the enemy craft. once the vessel would sink to about 25 feet, the main explosive charge would explode with the rest of those 5,000 pounds plus of explosives. So I know that doesn't sound like it doesn't make a lot of sense when I explain it, so I think this gives you a good visualization, and this is from the report. So you're sailing your vessel in, you've got that pinup device anchoring you to the enemy vessel, your scuttling charge goes off, your small vessel sinks below the surface, and once it gets to about 25 feet, the rest of the explosives go off. And the idea would be essentially to deal a debilitating blow to the hull of that enemy craft and sink it in place in the harbor. So it's pretty ingenious. The other really cool part about this project was the disguise part of the project. And this may actually be my favorite part. They envisioned all kinds of different disguises for these craft. And so what you're seeing here are illustrations from the report. On the left-hand side, you're seeing in the dark gray are the outline of the various vessels, so the A1 or the A2s and A3s, and then the larger Army rescue boat. And then they essentially build a disguise on top of that, right? The disguises were intended to be vessels that were local in nature, so that once they entered the harbor, there wasn't questioned by the Japanese, military or Japanese Navy, right? So if you had a small craft or your missile disguised as a Japanese fishing boat, then no one's going to think anything about it, right? There's a million fishing boats going in and out of the harbor. So they came up with not just Japanese disguises, but they also have, on the top is an A2 disguised as a Mandalay wood boat, A3 disguised as a Cantonese harbor craft. It's probably like a pilot boat to bring other vessels in. And then the Army rescue boat disguised as a Irrawaddy river steamer. So they came up with all these kinds of scenarios that they could use this remote control for. And so in the report they mentioned, how did they determine what they were going to use? They used intelligence reports, photographs, all very high-tech stuff at the time. Fishing vessels, I mentioned, were in particular the most popular disguise because again, these fish going into local communities are resources that are needed, especially during a time of war. So you want to let those things in. The speedboats would have been disguised, but they still have engines on them that would have been remote controlled in. So they built essentially these compartments around the engines to muffle the sound. And we'll see that in the video a little bit. So they came up with these plans, and then they came up with a decision to test Operation Campbell to see if it actually even worked. And so they decided to do this test in summer of 1944, right here in the Pensacola area. They wanted to test a couple of different things. They wanted to, again, remote control was a new technology, so they wanted to test the maneuverability of the remote control. They wanted to test the seaworthiness of this disguised vessel. And they wanted to, of course, test the ability of it to sink an enemy ship. So what they did for their operational test is they used the smallest of the 3 proposed boats. They used that A2 hacker craft, and they disguised it, I don't know why, as a Danish fishing boat from Copenhagen. And as we'll see in the video, they even put a man, like a dummy, a mannequin, on the boat to look like he's steering it. They just tied his hand to the tiller so it looks like he's doing it himself. And the mission of this initial test run in summer of 1944 was to sink the 5,000-ton freighter San Pablo, right? So if you remember, I mentioned at the beginning, San Pablo had been hit by a German U-boat off of Costa Rica earlier in the war. They were able to refloat it, but it wasn't seaworthy anymore. They couldn't use it for anything but something like this, essentially cannon fodder, right? So they brought it here, and they staged San Pablo about 9 miles off of Santa Rosa Beach, right? So just south of the Pensacola Pass, about 9 miles. So this is another illustration from the report. You can see the outline of the A2 hacker craft in the dark gray, and then you can see the disguise they built on top of it. So they essentially made it look like a wooden fishing vessel. You have a mast, you have nets, you have barrels, places you would have stored fish. There's the guy there on the tiller at the end. And then there's some photos here too, but they're also featured in the video that we'll see in a minute. So the ship itself, we've talked about this a little bit. The object of Operation Campbell, or the test run of Operation Campbell. San Pablo, I mentioned, was built in 1915 in Belfast, Ireland. The company that built it was the Workman Clark and Company, which is a huge shipbuilding company in Ireland, 315 feet in length, 44 feet wide, is about a 5,000-ton vessel. So this is not a small ship. This is a cargo container, or a cargo carrier, rather. The ship was eventually bought by the United Fruit Company, which eventually became the Chiquita banana. So if you're familiar with like fruit lore, the Chiquita banana that we know and love today because of all the controversy around United Fruit Company. But what they did essentially was transport fruit from Central America to the United States for food sources. It was sunk in 1942 off Costa Rica, and then it was eventually brought to Tampa and then Pensacola and declared a loss because it wasn't seaworthy anymore. So these are actual photos of San Pablo before she sank. So that operational test. The operational test happened on August 11th of 1944. They had their disguised A2/Danish fishing vessel loaded with 3,846 pounds of Torpex explosives. So they didn't actually max it out at the 5,000 pounds. They just used a little bit less than that. They piloted the vessel via aircraft. So it was a B-17 that took off from Naval Air Station Pensacola with an RC controller on the inside of the ship. You can see they mentioned that one of their objectives was to test the maneuverability of the vessel. So you can see it kind of has a silly path. They were doing kind of figure eights and loops to see how well the remote control actually worked, and it did. It worked really well. So there's a picture of the target vessel sitting off of Pensacola right before she sank. This is the path coming out from Pensacola, the Pensacola Pass, all the way about 9 miles offshore. And then the photo you see in the background, which we'll also see in the video, is the outcome. So, I don't feel like I'm giving away spoilers because we're talking about a shipwreck, but it worked. Operation Campbell worked. San Pablo sank in under 2 minutes. Under 2 minutes. And divers actually went down, Navy divers went down to investigate the damage once it was sunk. It's only in about 80 feet of water, so very much within recreational diving limits. They went down to kind of explore it and see what damage was done, and it was a 40 by 20 foot hole in the side of the vessel. So, and again, this is a big cargo, steel vessel, or iron vessel, steel plated. The reports from the RC controller or the plane was that the geyser of water that was created from the explosion went up approximately 600 feet high from the site. So, those almost 4,000 tons of explosives were overkill even for this 5,000-ton vessel. So I would say that's a success of Operation Campbell.
They want to sink it.
Yeah. So now I have the video. So I've kind of explained it, given you the rough overview. The video is fun to watch because it is an artifact in and of itself of 1944. So they even have a narrator with a very lovely mid-Atlantic accent, or what are they, transatlantic accent. So I'm going to play that now.
Harbor targets are hard to get at, hard to hit. Shore defense presents special tough problems. Against air attack, the enemy stations flatboats well out at sea to signal the alarm. Air centers collate intelligence, organize flights of land-based defense fighters. Barrage balloons prevent low-level attacks, and concentrations of anti-aircraft send up a thick pattern of fire. The Tirpitz, here knocked out on April 3, 1944, was reported July 31, 1944, repaired and ready for action again. Against sea attack, enemy destroyers scout the waterway approaches to the harbor.
Just kind of explaining the problem, right? How hard it is to get to these enemy
mine layers
vessels.
make these approaches hazardous. Hydrophonic detectors stand by to dispatch squadrons of fighter planes. and finally coast artillery, light guns, big guns. The harbor is a good shelter. Booms, submarine nets, minefields, coast guns, anti-aircraft, nearby airports, radar. The sweeter the target, the heavier the shore defense. Allied naval superiority may have forced the Nazis and Japanese to landlock their warships for protection, but these landlocked ships nevertheless serve as threats to our convoys, tie up important Allied units which have to stand guard against sneak hit-and-run raids. Enemy bridges could be blown up. Troop ships could be hit at the moment of disembarkation. Canals could be bottled up. Submarines may be put out of commission, but shore defense protects them well against normal sea and air attack. Every major German and Japanese held harbor presents in itself a number of tempting objectives. All these and many more are choice targets, and yet to date shore defense makes it difficult to destroy them without disproportionately expensive losses in men and equipment. In the spring of 1944 at Chesapeake Bay, a different form of attack was tested, involving a single missile, which, using special OSS techniques, could get through enemy harbor barriers by deception, which could be precisely controlled to a specific target, and which, operating without personnel, would be expendable.
This was the first test of the remote control.
For purposes of this test, 2 men are used to take the motorboat out to its point of rendezvous with the plane. The plane carries on board the Campbell operator, who alone will control the motorboat, even though he will be miles away when rendezvous is established. The boat is a 34-foot A2 Hacker craft with a low silhouette. Powered by a 550 horsepower engine, it can do 35 miles an hour for a range of 220 miles, while carrying a maximum load of 5,000 pounds of explosives. The range can be extended by adding gas tanks. The craft is a projectile. It carries no personnel. In addition to its explosive charge, it has a radio control receiver and a television transmitter. The television camera, housed in the white box on the bow, is standard Army Air Forces portable equipment. In this test, the plane is used as the control. All the equipment the Campbell operator needs is a television receiver, including the screen, and a radio transmitter. Instead of the plane, the operator could be in a mothership, a submarine, another motorboat, or at a concealed position ashore. Preliminary tests having proved successful, preparations were begun in August 1944 on full-scale tests involving actual operational factors. The SS San Pablo, a 5,000-ton freighter anchored in the Gulf of Mexico off Pensacola, was selected as the target. Work began on the disguise. For deception purposes, Campbell lends itself easily to a variety of possibilities. As a fishing boat native to the area of operations, as one of the miscellaneous utility craft that crowd harbors, even as an enemy supply or light combat vessel, such as the German E-boat. In this case, the Hacker was converted into a rusty, weather-beaten Danish Spritzel fishing boat. The job, aging included, took a week. The choice of the fishing boat disguise is especially apt for an OSS sabotage operation. No matter how thoroughly guarded an enemy-held harbor may be, the authorities, pressed for food, are forced to let the local fishing fleet continue operating. The missile, properly disguised, could be slipped into the fleet from a mother ship, from a submarine, or by OSS operatives working in enemy territory. Once inside the harbor, it would be guided by remote radio television control into the target. The Hacker, converted into a Danish fisherman, rides heavy seas. The plywood hull built over the false frame takes the pounding with no sign of distress. The disguise, however, is not completed. To kill the giveaway speedboat exhaust, special mufflers are attached. The motors themselves are soundproof by nailing thick layers of cellotex to the hatches. Provision is made to simulate the characteristic chug-chug of a fishing boat diesel engine. To get back to the Danish fishing boat K354, Amo firmly grasps the tiller and the disguise is finished.
Amo's the mannequin.
The pin-up device makes contact, driving the two pins into the side of the target. The missile is scuttled. The cables attached to the pins hold the explosives close to the ship. 25 feet below, the bombs will go off. Drop the disguise and the true nature of the craft as an attacking projectile becomes revealed. Television antenna and camera, television transmitter, radio control receiver. The B-17 used as the control plane is quickly fitted out for Campbell. Radio control equipment above. Below, the television receiver. The rubber hood attached to the screen cuts off outside light and permits clear vision. The plane takes off to rendezvous with the K-354. Two men take the missile out from the dock.
So at some point we lose the audio in the video.
The operator is ready to take over control. The crew of the missile goes overboard, is picked up by the boat from which these shots were taken. The missile is now completely under the control of the plane.
Okay, so I don't think there's any more audio after this point, but you get to see it explode.
Wow.
It's very impressive.
Guess that worked.
It worked, yeah. And local reports and newspapers and kind of oral histories have said that people could hear it, you know, that far. It's not really, 9 miles really isn't that far away. So the sound carried a little bit to the community that was still on land, but that was the video. And I know it's a little bit long, but I think it's always worth looking at in the context of the presentation because it's very interesting.
Yes, it is.
Very neat.
Your explaining it first was a big help.
Yeah, because the audio is not spectacular. So, yeah, okay, good. I'm glad you said. Sometimes I feel like it's
And the
repetitive.
technical terms, you know, it's,
Yeah.
made it much easier to understand. Thank you.
Good.
The dummy's name.
What's that?
The dummy's name.
Amo.
Amo. Amo.
So real quick, you know, to kind of wrap up, I just wanted to talk about the site as a dive spot. So, you know, what is San Pablo today? So it certainly is an archaeological site. It's, you know, in the United States, we classify those as things that are 50 years old or older. But it's certainly an archaeological site and one that has been researched by students at the University of West Florida and the Florida's Bureau of Archaeological Research. But today, it's, again, 9 miles off of Santa Rosa Island. It's about 80 feet deep, although there are lots of really big and amazing features on this site, which is why I think so many fish are attracted to it. So what we've got on the bottom here, this is a side scan sonar image of the entire wreck site. So what you're seeing are the bow of the vessel. Can you see my mouse? No. Bow of the vessel on that side, and then the stern of the vessel. And then here in the middle, you have the boilers, which would have been used, you know, as part of the propulsion for the ship. You also have, I don't know that you can see it very much on the sonar image, but you also have the refrigeration coils from the vessel. So the refrigeration coils would have been used to keep the fruit at a lower temperature while it was being transported to the U.S. So you can see all these kinds of parts and pieces of the vessel, even though it's, you can see, quite exploded on the seafloor. one of my favorite things about the site, not just because it's a cool site and it's within a good recreational diving depth, but there's always a ton of life on the ship because there is so much relief off of the bottom. So we see things like sharks, Goliath grouper, there's also schools of amberjacks, spadefish, yeah, and stuff. Flounder on some of the, the bottom parts of the site. There's lots of good places to hide. We've seen eel, octopus, the slipper lobster, all kinds of stuff out there. So it's a fantastic site for many different reasons. And here's a photo of one of those boilers at kind of the diver for scale. The site today is part of the Florida Panhandle Shipwreck Trail, and I don't know if anyone's heard of that before. I may have talked about it at the last talk briefly, but this was a program of the Florida Division of Historical Resources using funding from after the Deepwater Horizon event. And the idea after Deepwater Horizon was to try to get dive tourism back to Northwest Florida because a lot of it evaporated after the oil spill. And so they created this trail of 12 shipwrecks from Port St. Joe to Pensacola as unique and special dive sites for people to go and visit. Some of them are natural shipwrecks like San Pablo, meaning that they were not sunk intentionally as artificial reefs. Some of them are artificial reefs that were sunk in recent times to be dive spots for people. But today, they actually expanded it due to its initial popularity, so it's 20 dive sites from Pensacola to Port St. Joe. So you get a little passport, and you get your stamp if you dive the site, and then if you send the passport in, you get a t-shirt and a certificate. So it's kind of one of those, tourism things that is intended to get people spending money in our communities. And if you wanted to check that out, you could just Google Florida Panhandle Shipwreck Trail, or it's floridapanhandledivetrail.com. And I need to get out there and get some really good video, but this was some of the promotional footage of, they had some promotional footage from dives on the site, but really it looks a lot like the pictures you've already seen. There's big schools of fish, and then there's the big boilers, and then all kind of the parts and pieces of the ship laying on the ground. But I always like to end with kind of a message, right, about underwater historic preservation. So, these sites are incredible archaeological sites that tell us about our community history and about, that time period in which they were sunk or created or serviced the communities that we have here. And so our kind of shtick is that these things are worth preserving. And I'm probably kind of preaching to the choir with this one, since it seems historically exciting. But they're important to preserve for a number of reasons. And those reasons include things like education, right, learning. But they also include things like heritage tourism, right, getting people here to spend money. They're important for recreation, not only for divers, but any day that you take a boat out to San Pablo, you're not going to see just dive boats. You're also going to see fishermen on the site too, because they know there's a ton of fish on this site. So they're important for a variety of different reasons. And we always advocate or tell groups that we speak to that stewardship is a very important thing. We should care for these places. When we have the opportunity to voice our opinions about preservation, we should do that, because there's really no one else out there that's going to do it for us. And archaeologists could talk until our heads turn blue, but really, the impetus for preservation has to come from communities, from people living in these places. So our kind of message essentially is that we learn about these things, we can understand them better, appreciate them, and eventually preserve them. And when we visit these sites, we've kind of borrowed from the National Park Service a little bit, but we want to take only photos. We don't want to remove things from these sites, and we leave only bubbles, right, if you're a diver. So thank you all very much for letting me come and speak with you again tonight.
Great.
You're welcome. Good job.
Thank you. I'm happy to answer any questions you have.
Yes,
Yeah, we'll go from left to right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Getting a military dump inside here,
Yes.
where they're located in relationship to the ship.
They're kind of all over.
That's what I thought.
Yeah, they are all over. There's military, naval aircraft, all kinds of things offshore Pensacola. Some of them are public numbers, so if you go onto like the Pensacola Fishing Forum, or you go into any of the dive shops, they'll have numbers for those sites for you if you're interested in.
Gotcha.
But yeah, there's a ton of stuff.
That's okay.
Yeah.
Did you dive the San Pablo?
Yeah, well, it's been, last time I dove it was last July, so it's been a little bit over a year since I was there last. But, a lot of there's been some concern about these sites with hurricanes and big storms moving through. But San love the Oriskany, but you know what, I'll be honest with you. So those of you who don't know, the Oriskany is an artificial reef that was sunk in 2004. It's the largest artificial reef in the world, right? It's an aircraft carrier that was decommissioned. John McCain served on the Oriskany. And they sunk it in about 240 feet of water offshore. And the idea was to create a site that would be good for both recreational divers who can only go so deep, and then for technical divers who do the deep, exciting stuff, and go, you know, deeper, and they penetrate the vessel and all that stuff. The Oriskany, it's got a cool factor because it is like the biggest in the world, but it's not as good as this dive because the fish that are attracted to it are the big, deep water pelagic fish. So if you want to see sharks, if you want to see amberjack, you can go to the Oriskany. But if you want to see, you know, more tropicals, and including those other things, San Pablo's really the place to go for that. And you can stay down there longer. Yeah. Yeah.
How would the relationship?
Nobody really knows the answer to that. The idea, I think, I kind of floated this to a couple people, is that because it was a secret mission, they kind of, even though the report was decommissioned, it didn't mean that people, the report was made public. It doesn't mean that people really had that report. So I think people just had to explain why this thing was out there. And in the years after World War II, there was a lot of attention, you know, with the Cold War to the Russians. So my thought is maybe like that's how they tried to explain the appearance of this massive ship. I don't know that's a fact, I guess.
It's been around for years.
Yeah. People still call it the Russian
Yeah.
ship. You walk into a dive shop, they're not gonna know what you're talking about when you say San Pablo.
That's it.
Yeah. Yes, you will.
Yeah, I've got a question for you. A couple. What did you say the name of the company that built the ship originally?
It was the Workman's Clark Company.
And that's right, Belfast, they built the Titanic. Yes. And then I didn't look at the ruse and deception from a different angle to it. 9 miles out is not that far, and that kind of explosion gets a lot of attention.
Yeah.
It seems to me more to be a ruse and deception to keep people's eyes off the Manhattan Project. Yeah, there was a lot of that going on. They did, you know, they chose to, my father was involved with this, they chose to do the practice landing invasion in Zamboanga, where it was part of the Philippines. The Philippines is huge. It was a part where they knew that there was Japanese spies.
Yeah.
So
Interesting.
it was a lot of, so when they talk ruse and deception,
Yeah.
sometimes it's to keep your eyes off the real target.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, and maybe, you know, this was something that they kind of wanted to test peripherally anyways,
But 9 miles.
9 miles is
They
not
could have
that
taken
far.
it out 50 miles and nobody would have heard a thing.
Well, and you think about like all of the ships that come in and out today, there were even more in 1944. So there were fishing boats out there, everything was out there. So.
Right.
Well, I don't know, and necessarily the ruse of deception was not aimed at like hiding it from the local people, but more about hiding it from the Japanese, maybe. But that's an interesting thing. Maybe it was to get attention away from.
Yeah, they had listeners, especially after Doolittle's Raiders. This area was really hot with spy activity.
It would be interesting. I mean, probably that opportunity is not there anymore, but to talk to someone who
Yeah.
was involved
Yeah,
with the
sure.
project and kind of get their bigger perspective on
Sure,
its place
yeah.
in the war.
Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. Well, if you'll permit me to plug one more thing that we have going on. If you like archaeology and you're interested in hearing more about some of what we got going on locally, and this is not underwater, and this is not a fancy shipwreck like San Pablo, but we do have a talk coming up at the Archaeology Institute on October 3rd at 7 p.m. About the 1559 Tristan da Luna settlement site here in the Pensacola area, over in East Pensacola Heights. So Dr. John Worth, who's one of our professors in the Department of Anthropology, he's the principal investigator for that site. He's going to be talking about all of the updates that they've had on the archaeology in recent years. So if that's something you might be interested in, you all are welcome to come to the Archaeology Institute. It's on the UWF main campus, and if you're coming in the main road, it's the first building on the right. And we have a free parking lot, which most campus does not have. But if you can't make it, we're going to put it online, too. So if you'd like to join via Zoom, you can register with the QR code there. And I can send out the link to Jim or to Barbara if you want to share that with other folks.
Please do.
Yeah. So you can join us virtually, too, if you can't make it that night. Yeah. That's all I've got. I'm done now. Oh, yeah. So Barbara wanted me to reiterate a point that I had made last time about doing underwater archaeology. We kind of, we take it for granted because we hear a lot lot about it locally, and UWF is so involved in it. But there are really only 3 schools in the United States that do underwater archaeology as a degree, as a focus for a degree. And that's University of West Florida, East Carolina University, which is in Greenville, North Carolina, and Texas A&M University, which is in College Station, Texas. So if you're choosing to do underwater archaeology, and your choice is between 3 schools, 2 of which are landlocked, I feel like the choice is obvious. University of West Florida. But yeah, it is a unique thing, and there are people who teach these things like a class at other places, but not as a focus for their degree with field opportunities right in our backyard. I mean, that's very unique, so. It's a cool thing about our program.
Is Dr. Ben still visit your underwater archaeology? Does she keep her hand in?
She is very much active. I mean, she's spending some time on her hobbies now, but she's an incredible woodworker and carpenter, which I'm astounded by what she produces. But yes, she's around, and she's writing a new book, and she's working on doing a National Register nomination for the Luna settlement.
And could you repeat who we're talking about, please, the name?
Dr. Judy Benz.
Thank you.
Yes. So she was the founder of archaeology at the University of West Florida, and she also served as the president of the university in recent years. And now she's emeritus.
She used to speak to us quite often.
Yes.
Past years.
She's a wonderful speaker.
Yes, she is.
Yeah.
Well, that is great. Let's have another round of applause. Like if you want these.
Well, I have a 5-year-old.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, you have 2 dozen ginger crinkles.
Like the conspiracy theory.
Thank you so much.
I'm not sure so much as conspiracy theory, it's a thought out
It's my
way that
favorite
they did the OSS work back in the day, so.
And saying Russia would definitely turn
Perhaps,
people's head
but,
that way
When you have it
instead
that
of.
close to coast.
Right.
Yeah.